everyone. Welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, the podcast for all disciplines, paths, players, and game masters. With your questers, Josh and Dan, I am Dan.
And I am Josh.
And on today's podcast, we will be discussing all things apocalyptical as we talk about how to survive the wastes. That section of the map way up for the western border, maybe not even on the map anymore. We'll get there. If you have any questions for us about what you're going to hear tonight, please drop us a line at edsgpodcast@gmail.com and let us know any thoughts you have or questions you have for Josh, by all means. So, initial thoughts on the wastes.
The wastes are another example of an area that was devastated by the Scourge, similar to the Badlands. It's just another manifestation of that. The backstory provided for the wastes in earlier material was that it was another fertile area with a lot of people living in it and kaers and so forth, and it just got absolutely bodied by the Scourge. Not a lot of explanation was given in any earlier material about what was going on. It was just this weird area that was devastated, and it's more notable by the effect that it has on parts of Western Barsaive than the Badlands, which is a place that more frequently would be an area that adventurers would potentially venture into, simply because it's actually on the map where the Wastes is kind of not.
Fair. Yeah. Badlands, being just bad, air quotes, is in the middle of the map near the bottom. The Wastes, just by the name alone, is indicative of how much worse off it is than the Badlands. So, one of those things. But yes, it's also on the far side of the map and hardly ever seen. So, more than likely, people wouldn't be traveling there, but just in case you are, that's what this episode is for. So yes, the Wastes are the western boundary. The horrors blighted that land just like they did the Badlands. The interesting thing about the Wastes in the essay, in the Earthdawn Survival Guide book itself, it does say that it grows hotter the further west one travels into the Badlands. So that's just an interesting little wrinkle there. So if you're the game master, note that. And of course, bring tons and tons of water.
Other than that reference in the survival guide, that's not something that's really brought up or explored in other places. Fair. It seems a little bit weird with that because on the other side of the wastes is Vazgothia. And there's nothing in the original Vazgothia essay from the Theron Empire book that talks about what would be Eastern Vazgothia having any kind of heat issue or whatever that would indicate what's going on with the wastes. And the sections in the Elven Nations book that talks about the wastes, because that book ended up sort of connecting the wastes to the Western kingdoms.
Yes.
Also doesn't really deal with that at all. So that's a little bit of an aspect that you might bring into your game, but isn't something that is broadly a part of that region's lore so much.
Fair. Do with it what you will, as they say. So the wastes, a couple of little pointers for the wastes. It is said that it held more kaers than anywhere else, and that there are more lost kaers there than anywhere else, numbering somewhere perhaps in the hundreds, or at least more than 100. How's that?
Yeah. It says that it had probably even more than the Badlands did. We talked about the Badlands several episodes ago and how it was probably one of the areas in Barsaive that has the most lost or forgotten or corrupted kaers of any part of Barsaive.
Yes.
And the wastes are like that, but cranked up. One thing that I do want to mention with regards to the wastes, we talked about the Badlands and how from a descriptive, geographic, environmental standpoint, you can take a lot of inspiration from the western deserts of the United States.
Yeah.
The high deserts in Arizona and Nevada and Utah and Death Valley in California and things like that. You know, even going down into parts of northern Mexico and Baja California and whatnot. I'm not as familiar with the terrain in those areas, but still a very desert, rocky, not particularly well suited to human survival areas.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of existing resources, photography and that kind of thing that you can use and draw on for your descriptions and imagery that you can show to players about what the Badlands might be like.
Yeah.
The wastes don't really have any equivalent of that, because the effect of the wastes is that while it is another sort of destroyed area, the key feature of the wastes is the perpetual ash that hovers in the air and blows along the winds onto western Barsaive, resulting in the poison forest and the sort of nastiness of the environment that is in Jerris.
Yes.
And the problems, emotional malaise that affects the people that live in that area. And actually, I suspect that with the original idea of the waste just kind of blowing in this ash is probably where the thought of it getting hotter as you traveled further west came from. Perhaps a hint that there is some kind of large fire or conflagration or some other kind of thing going on that is generating the destruction or the ash that then blows out of there. And again, that's something that kind of got modified with the explanations in Elven nations, simply because it was not something that had really been explored before.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm okay with that. Probably just one of those sentences that was put in there and then to lose point, see what somebody can do with that, if anything at all. So who knows?
Yeah, and it's not that we explained where the ash actually comes from in the Elven Nations book.
Mm-hmm.
One of the themes that ties into that area, similar to the research that goes on into the Badlands to try and find out why it's expanding and things like that, is to find out possibly what's going on with the ash and what is causing it.
Yeah, totally. So aside from the 100 plus kaers and the mystery of the ash creation, Vivain and Rugaria both had towns and magical schools in the wastes before the Scourge. So even more reasons to go there if you really want to risk going there.
Yes, with those magical schools and such, there were a lot of magical artifacts and items and lore and research knowledge that could potentially be found if you can locate those areas and survive the journey to them and the time necessary to exhume, for lack of a better term, the stuff that is there and then to make your way out. Agreed.
You mentioned two things. We're going to bring them up simultaneously, which is that the black ash from the wastes. Let's describe that a little bit. It's kind of a fine black powder, almost like volcanic ash, just in description for everybody out there. And it does have this perpetual cloud over the wastes with occasionally some breezes or whatnot blowing it further over there. And as you said, it does land in Jerris primarily because that's due east of the wastes. Any exploration you're going to be doing in the wastes is going to launch from Jerris. It is the closest city with supplies that might last you for your duration in the wastes. Did I miss anything?
Not really. No, nothing immediately comes to mind on that.
Fair. Yay me. So as you're traveling into the wastes, here's some geographical things to watch out for, because this is what the Survival Guide podcast is for, and the Survival Guide book is for, is to warn you of these things. There are ravines. There are eddies. There are puddles of black ash that will become quicksand, which we were all warned about way too much in the 70s. If you grew up in the 70s, that quicksand was going to be a major problem in your life. And the early 80s, yes. So watch out for those, but travel is going to be difficult and unpleasant. Again, Badlands, wastes, these are not good names. So you should expect the absolute worst. Pack animals will need to be bribed or coaxed or cajoled to going in there because the smell is not good. The air is not good. It's depending upon if you want to do the heat or not heat, just unbearable and, again, inhospitable. So they're not going to want to go.
Yeah. It's just a nasty area, and animals have a lot more sense than people when it comes to things like that.
Exactly. Carts and wagons are going to either get slip on the terrain or get stuck in drifts of this ash. The ash will taint the water, possibly adding disease or sickness. And we've done a whole podcast episode on diseases and sicknesses. So reference that if you'd like to. Ash also therefore prevents food from growing. And the cloud of ash also prevents any rainfall. So there are no resources. There's fewer resources here than in the Badlands.
In its own way, yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine that there is probably still the occasional precipitation that will sort of come across, but it mixes with the ash when it does show up in a way that makes things rather nasty. So in this way, kind of think of the ash as like toner from a laser printer.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
You know how that like kind of just like it's very fine powder that kind of gets on everything, but then if it gets wet, it's even worse.
Yes.
Like it would just kind of like stick to things and cake things up. Yeah, it's just really nasty. And while there is disease and other things like that, I mean, we can see the effect that it has on the poison forest. Yeah. How the poison forest is this land that is caught in a perpetual state of dying, of decay, without actually being dead. And the emotional impact that it has on the people who live in Jerris, particularly those who actually live there as opposed to just visiting. Sort of it can deaden their emotional response to things until those moments where it all maybe kind of explodes in a burst of violence or upset or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be pretty nasty.
Agreed. So that's some geographical things to worry about. Let's talk some magical thing to worry about, which is something we didn't quite do with everybody else, but this one made it special in the essay. The wastes are now the most corrupted region of astral space. So your spell magic and your higher circle talents are going to be very dangerous for you to use. Do you care to elaborate?
Yeah, so the general consensus is that the ash in the wastes is a manifestation, is a symptom of the severe astral corruption and pollution that exists in that area because of the horror's activity during the Scourge. That damage to astral space can manifest in strange ways, including, just to kind of toss out ideas here, that perhaps that there's so much polluted astral energy that maybe a spell matrix doesn't sufficiently, like it provides you a little bit of protection, but doesn't completely prevent you from suffering perhaps reduced, but the effects of raw magic casting in some way.
Yeah.
But even to that point, if the damage to astral space and the magical energies involved are so extreme that certain talents or abilities that interact more with astral space or a bit more magically obvious could have strange side effects or weird things that could happen. There's plenty of excuses for a game master to have weird magical phenomena that don't really have an explanation, or to provide obstacles or challenges to the characters being able to use their abilities that sort of fit in theme with the idea that they are not in a safe place. Similar to the kind of stuff that you might see in the twists and the Southern Catacombs in Parlength, where there was a lot of magical experimentation and stuff that was going on, and the effects that has had on astral space there. You can have a kaer or a small area in the wastes just have really weird magical stuff going on. I love magical weirdness. I love doing things that are a little bit offbeat and strange. I don't like codifying and locking down every possibility of how stuff works. And so the wastes can give you an opportunity to really go gonzo, for lack of a better term. Coming up, I'm not sure when it's going to be released, but Monte Cook Games several months ago did a Kickstarter for a product called The Strange.
No, The Weird.
The Weird. Was that what it was? The Weird, The Strange, something like that. Anyway,
well,
it is
The
a
Strange
book.
is a whole different role-playing game. I have it on the shelf, but The Weird is a book that's universal for any game you're possibly playing. I backed it. It should be here in October.
Okay, I couldn't remember the name of it. I backed it, but the idea is that it is a book about bringing the strange and unusual and the weird and the whimsical or darkly whimsical into your game, and it feels like the wastes would be a really cool place to bring some of those ideas in.
Absolutely.
Bringing in like some, to pull a couple of my favorite sort of darkish fantasy references, to bring some kind of like Dark Crystal energy into your game.
The Dark Crystal, Jim Henson.
There you go. Dark Crystal, actually, the the lands that the Skeksis control kind of feel like the wastes, where everything's kind of just like black and blasted and
scorched earth
kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or Labyrinth, which is a little bit more on the whimsical side of things, but also has like kind of a dark fantasy edge to it.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. And so I'm really looking forward to getting my copy of that book and diving into it and getting inspiration to pull some weird stuff out.
Exactly. So we're talking weird kind of like spell warping or talent inaccuracies or something along those lines.
Yeah, the possibility that maybe with poor results on a talent test, and I'm not necessarily thinking like, oh, when a swordmaster is using their melee weapons kind of thing, but more like perhaps Mystic Aim or something like that, where you're trying to make a connection.
Yeah.
Forge an actual magical connection to a target or another individual, that a poor result could end up with some kind of weird side effect or negative consequence that you normally don't see when you're using them in quote unquote normal areas.
Exactly.
And I think the more powerful the talent, like what tier it sort of becomes available at or what circle it's at, would be more likely to suffer from strange magical side effects, because those are talents that, generally speaking, are a little bit more magical. There's a general tendency that non-magician adepts don't have to worry so much about warping and astral damage and stuff that would come about as a result of raw magic.
Mm-hmm.
There could be ways that could affect adepts doing their normal stuff. There's a sense that I get, in a way, that the Badlands are a strong environmental and survival challenge. Mm-hmm. And while you have that in the wastes, that's not the theme that you go with there. That the bigger danger that you may want to focus on if you're doing an adventure that's going into the wastes at all is the magical hazard, the corruptive influence that's inherent to, in a sense, the very air that you are breathing because of the perpetual ash. The idea that you cannot rely as strongly on your magic to do what it needs to do. The wastes have the highest target number in terms of wilderness survival tests, but there may be even other talents that are interacting with the environment there that would be even worse. Like, there's the scout, and I think Beastmasters get it as well, maybe Elementalists, safe path, where you're like communicating with spirits that allow you to find a safe way to get to your destination.
Yeah.
Maybe that doesn't really work the same way at all within the wastes, because there are no safe paths. There are no polite or friendly spirits that are going to be able to provide that information to you. They are twisted or damaged or warped or corrupted in some way that they might lead you astray, intentionally or not. Just the opportunity to bring out a bunch of weird magical shit that you don't necessarily need to come up with an explanation for. Beyond, it's just weird magical stuff.
This is what happens when you do that thing here. You don't need a whole lot more explanation than that. So along those lines, since we're talking about things that are corrupted, there are a few things that you can, of course, encounter there besides just the bad terrain, besides the astral space and the iffy use of your spells and or talents and anything else magical you happen to have. Naturally, there are some beasties.
Yes.
Because why wouldn't there be? That's what role-playing games are about. So the beasts here in the Wastes are either horrors, constructs, undead, or disease-ridden.
Yeah. This is an opportunity where you would want to roll out those masks from the companion that are tainted and cadaverous and undead. Like, slap those masks on to your creatures.
Totally.
You don't just have a Brithin, you've got a Brithin that has the
undead diseased
corrupted mask on top of it.
Yeah.
Again, sort of lean into the nastiness that is the area, and in addition to the mechanical difficulties that those masks would provide, lean into perhaps some aspects of the body horror that would come about as a result of what has shaped these creatures into the way that they are, with them being twisted or deformed or misshapen or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
There is, of course, the potential of seriously creeping out your players. Mm-hmm. You want to be a little bit careful in some regards if you are going to be dealing with name givers or name giver adjacent opponents, like survivors of a corrupted kaer or ogres or cave troll equivalents or anything like that. There are a number of twisted and corrupted name givers that are in the companion that Morgan came up with for that book that could certainly fit without really much modification necessary into the Wastes. There is the tendency for deformed or misshapen individuals within sort of pop culture and literature historically of being presented as they are evil because of this. Perhaps one of the more blatant recent examples is from the movie 300.
Oh, yeah.
Where the deformed dwarf character is the one that betrays them because it's not really presented within the Spartan society, at least I didn't really recall it being read that way, that their treatment of him was a right and noble thing, but then also just the general presentation of the Persians, the adversaries within that, and the leadership of them also being sort of monstrous in their way.
Yes.
Obviously, you've got counterexamples like Quasimodo from Hunchback of Notre Dame, who is viewed by society perhaps as a monster, but we see within him that he is, as ennobled a spirit as anyone else and as deserving of love and respect.
Yeah.
And so it's just something that comes to my mind as a creator, as a writer, to try and avoid always falling into those nasty tropes. And it is not that the deformities or disabilities or whatever are what make them bad, or even that the corruption of the Wastes necessarily turns one into those kind of misshapen forms, that there is just as much of an opportunity of maybe having individuals that are not actually displaying any obvious physical signs of their damage or corruption, but still being just as twisted or bloodthirsty or magically potent without any obvious signs of that.
Yeah, take your expectations and kind of play with them a little bit.
Yeah, as long as you are not being one note about it, it's okay to have deformed opponents that are, for lack of a better term, evil. Yeah. As long as you have all of your evil characters being deformed, even if they are in different ways.
Yes.
Again, it's just it is a lazy shortcut that does not really do appropriate care, does not present people who may be suffering from those sorts of things with the appropriate care and humanity and empathy that we should perhaps consider when we are dealing with such things.
Fair enough.
I feel like this is getting away from me, but I hope people understand what I'm getting at.
It can all be trimmed, whatever.
Yes.
Yeah. So some of the things you'll come across there normally that live there on their own are mulgrooms, leech rats, plague lizards, and krill worms. And then there are, of course, the wastes versions of, and this is where Josh said to bring the masks in, especially, to your point, Brithons, lions, deer, and thundra beasts, just to name a few.
Yeah, those earlier entries are all creatures that already have an association thematically with darkness and corruption and creepiness, for lack of a better term. Death moths, I imagine, would be another thing that you could run into in the wastes, would seem rather appropriate.
Totally.
Then in that sort of second batch of things, just, any kind of quote-unquote normal wildlife, you slap undead mask or a corrupted mask or a tainted mask on it of some sort.
Yeah.
To make it manifest in some way the effect that the ash has had on them. And then, of course, there are quite a number of horrors ranging from your standard gnashers and whatnot all the way up to even more powerful named horrors. Bloat forms, I imagine, probably love the area. Worm skulls, probably as well, although they tend to be a little bit more common in the Badlands, I would feel. Despair thoughts, again, likely to hide out in the wastes where they can then send their astral projections out while keeping their physical bodies sort of protected in an area that is hazardous to folks that might be trying to track them down to destroy them. Greater versions of any or all of those, obviously, if you're looking at higher circle challenges.
Yeah.
There's a lot of potential for stuff there.
The only ones you missed, because of the 8 that were listed in the essay of minor horrors you could come across, Josh nailed 4 of them right there. So, yay, you and your brain. The only ones you missed are the Kreeskra, the Slipshades, the Plagues, and the Wing Flayers.
Those are all constructs more than... Most of those are more construct. The Kreeskra are horrors. Slipshades are horrors.
Yeah.
I think the Plagues are more of a horror construct, as are the Wing Flayers. Although the Wing Flayers are just weird in an awesome way. But
speaking of weird, and then the last thing is the Grey Folk. This is the only place you'll find the Grey Folk, and they are feral and they're barbaric, but they're name givers. So the question is, are they real, or are they just bandits who've put on this act?
I would think that anybody who lives within the wastes, even if they're just on the edges of it, is going to be altered by the environment there in a way. I don't think that long-term you would have a group that would be able to operate out of the wastes and not be affected by them. So while it's possible that there may be bandit groups or whatever that may be put on this persona in order to appear more fearsome or to have people be afraid to chase them down or otherwise sort of deal with them, if they are operating out of the wastes, I think it is more likely that they tend to be along the lines of cave trolls and other name givers who have had their culture and background devastated as a result of what their kaers may have suffered during the Scourge, and are also coping with the corruption that is infecting their very being by living within that environment. And it could be that there are aspects of the ashen corruption that comes about that maybe there is some kind of guiding intelligence behind it in a way that is not just destroying these individuals, but making them into constructs or minions of a sort all on its own for whatever kind of nefarious purpose that it might desire.
Remind me, because I can't think of the name off the top of my head because my notes are gone. What's the microscopic horror? What's
the Dread Iota?
Yeah, the Dread Iota. Who's to say that some of this cloud is not made up of some Dread Iota?
Or something very similar.
Yes.
As a possibility. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is certainly the case. The research that has been done that's talked about within the setting material into the ash doesn't give any strong indication that the ash itself is necessarily sentient or active in its own way, that it appears to just be a manifestation or a side effect of what's going on.
Fair.
But whatever it is that is sort of driving the production of the ash in the first place could very well have a powerful named horror behind it lurking somewhere in the depths of the wastes that is able to, especially as you may get closer to where it is, manipulate or shape the ash in a way. Perhaps there is some kind of strange, unique marking thing that happens with it. If you're looking for a real sort of horror campaign, and horror with a capital H as sort of the theme of the game, where you're dealing with horror stalkers or other ideas like that, where you're really exploring the damage and the after effects of the Scourge, you could absolutely have a major campaign arc or goal being the discovery of whatever you as the GM decide to put as the source of the ash in the wastes, and to go and deal with it, and to perhaps begin to reclaim that area. I think that much like the Badlands, the goal of cleansing and restoring that area is a epic task.
Oh yeah, because
the work of generations.
No dragon lives there.
The dragons know not to mess with it. And again, I'm sure the dragons are performing perhaps their own research and such into what might be going on there, but the source of it feels like one of those things that is best left for an individual game master to come up with based on the needs of the game. And if you don't need to, just let it be a weird manifestation of or after effect of the Scourge.
Well, and not everything needs an explanation. Once you reveal the mystery, all the wonder about it is gone. So I personally would leave it as unsolvable by the player characters. So any final thoughts on how to survive the wastes? Because really, if you don't have to go there, don't. Like the Badlands, like Death Sea, like...
Not really. In the survival guide book from first edition, there are some game mechanics that are presented. Travel is difficult. Visibility is a lot more limited. It's like kind of dealing with a fog that is always up and around by this particulate matter that is in the air.
Yeah.
Especially at night, it is difficult to navigate because it obscures your ability to sight the stars and the moon and other celestial bodies. So the difficulties of navigation and such is higher. The difficulty, obviously, as given in the rules for the wilderness survival talent, is a lot more difficult to find supplies, food, water, shelter, and so forth. There's rules in there for how the ash affects people. We have different rules for it in the Elven Nations book. It talks about the spell casting and raw magic effects of the wastes on things. It's kind of like the entire wastes are affected by, there's a Circle 10 wizard spell in first edition called Warp Astral Space. Everyone casting spells in astral space suffers a penalty to their tests, and sometimes will have secondary effects that if you fail the test, it might have it end up hitting an unintended target or doing some other kind of weird secondary effect. They don't really talk in there about how it might affect talents, but I would say magicians often get a lot of abuse that doesn't end up affecting other disciplines as well, so spread the love on that. Maybe not having necessarily the spellcasting penalties or anything like that, but maybe some of the more blatantly magical talents could have strange side effects if you don't roll well enough.
I'm okay with that. I would do the same thing there. So, folks, if you have any questions for us about how to survive any of these areas that you've heard about before, because we have a couple left, please drop us a line at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, don't get wasted by the wastes for your legend.
Good night, everybody.